been making very clear she maintains she's done nothing wrong at all.
OK, all right, thank you, Christopher. Judita, let me come to you first, because this actually ties in perfectly with the issue that we were going to be debating anyway, which is whether politicians from, let's call them working-class backgrounds, state school educated, are given a different level of tolerance, let's say, than the classic Eton public school boy set. Because she has definitely been under the cosh with certain areas of the media, let's say, in terms of this particular story, in a way that I don't think necessarily some of the boarding school, public school boys have.
I think it works both ways, because I always say that there's this weird catch-22 in politics where it's a dirty game that expects all players to be squeaky clean, which is impossible. But then, from as far back as when we were learning in school about Gladstone and Disraeli, there's always parapolitical discourse about on socioeconomic lines, on class lines. It's part of the playing field when you're in politics, who you are, where you came from, and do you have a right to be here. But what you've seen over time is that being working class, being blue collar, really moves the needle when it comes to voters, because they see themselves in you. So it works against the posh elite, because people think, like we've said, that has been mentioned this evening, you're out of touch, you don't represent me, you look down on me, you deign to represent what I think.
So why aren't there more people like that in politics?
Because it's almost like what happens when when they say people are bred for politics or bred for power. It's something you kind of commit to very early on in life, or your parents commit to. What you find is that with working class or lower middle class people, they don't have the same stability financially from their parents or grandparents for that plan to be put in action when it needs to be, so that by the time you're now in the playing field, your pedigree is already pre-polished to be entering that gaming landscape.
We can kind of name them, Matt, can't we, the famous politicians that weren't from the right side of the tracks. John Prescott is the really famous one.
Lee Anderson.
And Lee Anderson. And Tony Blair put Prescott in there, arguably for the reason that Judita was saying, because Tony Blair was kind of poshish and he appealed to, your sort of hedge fund managers. And yet John Prescott, we see in the footage here, the famous footage of him, which really played into that stereotype that he was a thug, dragged up from the streets. Yeah. He was there to offset the Blair public school cabinet, which was huge.
Well, working class politicians are so noticeable in this country because there are so few of them. And if you look at what's happened in the House of Commons over the last 30, 40 years, from the data on MPs, the share of MPs from working class backgrounds has collapsed to a historic low. I believe there's only 7% of MPs are from working class backgrounds. Meanwhile, the number of MPs who belong to the university class, who belong to the more elite university class, Oxbridge or Russell Group universities, has never been higher. The number of MPs who have always been in politics, have been local councillors, have been political party media officers, has never been higher. So Westminster has become more like an insular club, if you like. But, Bev, it's not just politics. It's media, much of the media too, creative industries, cultural institutions. I've written about this before. If you're working class, if you haven't gone to university, if you're not from London, if mummy and daddy aren't very rich and well off and connected in London circles, and if, God forbid, you also happen to hold culturally conservative views or anti-establishment views, then look, I mean, the deck is stacked against you in a whole array of institutions.
This current shadow cabinet at the moment, which might end up being our government, only 13% of them went to private school. Starmer went to a grammar school, which then actually became a private school while he was there. But does it matter, Judita?
It doesn't matter because it shouldn't matter. But it does matter because it's kind of like when they say, when you get in the ring, how good are your gloves? Because at the end of the day, whoever you're picking to be leader is going to be getting into the ring with the best of the best around the world. So do you have the pedigree, the preparation, and basically the wherewithal to represent the country against anyone who's put in the ring with you? And that's what the deck is stacked against them, because because you don't have the input and the infrastructure made available to you to begin to be cultivated to occupy these kinds of positions and the expectations of you when you're in them.
But you could be as intelligent.
Yeah.
Yeah, but let's just remember, this also has profound consequences, because who represents you then trickles down into the policies that affect your daily lives, into the decisions that shape our country. So there's a wonderful, I mean, I've written about this on Substack, but there's a wonderful book called Diploma Democracies, which has shown how across the West, as legislatures have become filled with, you know, elite university graduates from very privileged families that tend to share the same values, that tend to see the world in the same kind of way, what's happened is that the policy process and all of the decisions coming out of parliaments around those Western democracies have reflected the interests of that elite class at the expense of everybody else. So what do we need to do? We need to get more working class voices into politics. We need to get more non-graduates into politics.
You can't challenge the symptom unless you go back to the beginning. You're ill-equipped to do the job, because at the end of the day, no one's saying that you can't come. Why you're not stepping up for the job is because they don't feel equipped to do it. And I've always said, like, there's a difference between Westminster and local government. It matters more to the everyday person who's with you, who's the boots on the ground. Those should be more representative of working class blue collar people, because you're there in the trenches with everyday population. And that will then be a knock-on effect to the top, because, like you say, when it comes to an election, if you don't have all the soldiers marching in the same direction as you, your party falls apart. If they are the working class and they are the representation of the people, they will speak to the leadership.
The only issue there, and I agree with you, is, as we saw with Brexit, there is enormous class prejudice in this country. And when many of the institutions, the civil service, government, many prominent newspapers, many prominent journalists, the reason they struggled with things like Brexit is because it was overwhelmingly driven by ordinary working class people. And so when they were using words like gammons and bigots and thickos, most of those people, by the way, having gone to Oxford, studying PPE, living in London, Oxford, Cambridge, what that reflected, to me at least, as somebody from a pretty ordinary working class background, was this enormous amount of class prejudice in this country that we see playing out every day, every week. I think many of the institutions, Bev, need to ask themselves, why aren't there more normal, ordinary people in those institutions? We need to reform the institutions in this country. We need to basically open them up to a much wider array of perspectives.
You're state school educated, so am I. You're privately educated. Did anybody ever say to you, you should be a politician?
When I did my standardised testing, it was one of that, or go into stock and into the
stocks and shares.
But
the last thing we need are more bankers in politics.
But how about you, Matt? Did anybody ever say to you? Because listen, our inbox is very much wants you to stand as an MP. Listening to you tonight,
it's interesting. A lot of people on the Substack that we've got, they say the same thing, because I think for lots of people who are watching and listening, we can all sense the same thing, right? Which is that our politics and national conversation represent the values, the tastes and the priorities of 10% of this country. So 90% on a whole array of issues are feeling as though they're not even in this conversation at all. And I feel that when you turn on, you know, the media in the morning and so on, and you look at the decisions coming out of the House of Commons.
Sometimes on the way in, I'm driving into the Britain's Newsroom, I put on the Today programme on Radio 4.
But you see what I'm saying? Like, that's an ironic point.
So detached from most people that I know.
But I think it's ironic because from everything you've said, the glaringly obvious solution is what Americans call affirmative action. Because when you think about a lot of politicians...
What we would call positive discrimination.
Basically, yeah. Because things like a PPE from Oxbridge, that's kind of like the bread and butter of most politicians in Westminster. It's like a rite of passage to getting there. If you had a quote-unquote affirmative action policy in universities like Oxford and Cambridge for people from lower income families, because they're exceptionally intelligent people in state schools, and gave them access to that, then you're starting to offset the imbalance.
But better yet, why don't we even move away from this assumption that people who dominate our national life don't have to have gone to university? I mean, there is a discussion beyond that, which is why on earth are all of our institutions dominated by elite graduates? Why can't we just have some normal, ordinary people? Most people in this country, remember, have never gone to university. right?
But that's when
So
I
why
say
don't we
it
have
goes
some-
back to the expectations of playing in the global field. There are certain levels of conversation and certain styles of discourse that the discipline that is drummed into you by higher education prepares you for. Do you want the best kind of politician representing you or don't you?
We've got to take another break, I'm afraid, but you're all giving me a hard time saying that Boris Johnson didn't get told off for Partygate. I know he did. I know that, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Right.